Make no mistake about it, Bob Fratta is the epitome of an atomic bomb, and he exploded in a family.
Bob Fratta's intensifying sexual appetites prompted the divorce.
Farah Fratta's life was negotiated down to $1,000 and a car.
After spending 28 years on death row, Robert Allan Fratta was finally laid on the gurney inside the death chamber in Huntsville, Texas. When asked if he had any final words, he simply nodded and said, "I have no words." No apology, no emotion, just silence from the man once sworn to protect and serve. Fratta had always claimed he was innocent, even as the two men he paid to kill his wife confessed to the crime in chilling detail. He spent nearly 3 decades fighting the inevitable, hiding behind legal appeals and false bravado. But to those who knew the truth, his guilt was never in doubt. The night after Farah's murder, while her family mourned and police worked the scene, Robert appeared on camera, smiling, flirting with reporters, and flexing as though he were auditioning for a magazine cover. A man whose wife had just been executed in cold blood was trying to look handsome for the evening news. That haunting image of his grin would forever define him, the narcissistic cop who turned into a master manipulator and killer. What began as a crumbling marriage soon spiraled into obsession, lust, and control. Fratta wasn't just losing his wife. He was losing the power he had over her. Behind the walls of their Texas home, Farah lived in fear, trapped in a marriage filled with twisted fantasies and forbidden desires that only he enjoyed. When she finally decided to leave, he couldn't stand the thought of another man having her. So he did the unthinkable. He hired someone else to pull the trigger. This is not just the story of a murder for hire. It's a story about love that turned to hate, betrayal wrapped in control, and a forbidden kink that exposed the darkest side of a man who wore a badge. This is the story of Robert Allan Fratta, the ex-cop who thought he could get away with murder. Welcome to True Crime Matters. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into one of Texas's most disturbing murder-for-hire cases. Thank you for sticking with us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Before we talk about how Farah Fratta died, we need to talk about how she lived. Because Farah wasn't just a victim. She was a person, a mother, a daughter, and a woman trying to rebuild her life. Farah was born in 1961 and grew up in the Houston area. Friends described her as warm, vibrant, and deeply devoted to her children. She had shoulder-length brown hair, a bright smile, and an infectious laugh that could light up a room. Those who knew her said she was the type of person who would drop everything to help a friend in need. In her early 20s, Farah met Robert Allan Fratta. At the time, he seemed like a good match, stable, employed, and ambitious. Robert worked as a public safety officer, a position that carried authority and respect. He wore a badge, took an oath to protect citizens, and seemed to embody the values of law and order. Their courtship was relatively brief. They married and soon started a family. Within a few years, Farah had given birth to 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. On the surface, they looked like the perfect American family. A working father, a devoted mother, 3 beautiful kids, and a home in Atascocita, a quiet suburb northeast of Houston. But behind closed doors, cracks were beginning to show. As the years went by, Farah began to see a different side of Robert. The man who had once seemed stable and protective became controlling and demanding. He had expectations, dark, disturbing expectations that made Farah deeply uncomfortable. According to testimony that would later emerge in court, Robert had extreme and degrading sexual demands. He allegedly asked Farah to engage in acts that humiliated her, including coprophagia and urophilia, consuming human waste. These are paraphilias that fall into categories of extreme sexual deviation, and for Farah, they were completely unacceptable. She tried to refuse. She tried to explain that these acts violated her boundaries, her dignity, and her sense of self. But Robert didn't take no for an answer. The more she resisted, the more their relationship deteriorated. Friends later recalled that Farah had confided in them about her marriage. She told them she felt trapped. She said Robert made her feel worthless, that he treated her not as a partner, but as an object to be controlled. The emotional abuse was relentless. The psychological toll was crushing. By the early 1990s, Farah had had enough. She made the hardest decision of her life. She filed for divorce. For many women in abusive relationships, leaving is the most dangerous moment. Statistics show that a woman's risk of being killed increases dramatically when she tries to leave her abuser. Farah knew the risks. She knew Robert wouldn't take it well, but she also knew that staying meant losing herself completely. The divorce proceedings began, and almost immediately things turned hostile. Robert didn't want to let go. He didn't want to lose control. And most of all, he didn't want to lose custody of the children. Farah was seeking full custody, and she had good reasons. She documented Robert's behavior, his threats, and his attempts to intimidate her. Her attorney later testified that Farah had expressed fear for her life multiple times. She said explicitly, "I think Robert is going to kill me." In the months leading up to her death, strange things started happening. One night, someone broke into Farah's home. She woke up screaming, and the intruder fled. Nothing was stolen, nothing was vandalized, but the message was clear: you are not safe. Farah reported the incident to the police, but nothing came of it. There was no evidence, no witnesses, no way to prove who had been inside her home. But Farah knew. Deep down, she knew Robert was sending her a warning. Still, she pressed forward. She continued with the divorce. She continued fighting for custody. She refused to be intimidated. On November 9th, 1994, Farah went to a local hair salon. She had her shoulder-length hair cut short. A fresh start, friends said. A symbolic gesture that she was moving on, shedding the weight of her past, and stepping into a new chapter of her life. She had no idea that chapter would end in just a few hours. To understand why Robert Allan Fratta did what he did, we need to understand who he was. Robert was born and raised in Texas, and from a young age, he gravitated toward authority and structure. He eventually found his calling in law enforcement, becoming a public safety officer, a role that sat somewhere between security and traditional police work. He wore a uniform, carried a badge, and was responsible for protecting people. For Robert, that badge meant everything. It gave him power, respect, and a sense of identity. Co-workers described him as serious, disciplined, and sometimes rigid. He wasn't the type to joke around or let his guard down. He kept people at arm's length. Would do something like that. Meaning, do you know a hitman? Most people didn't take him seriously, but some did, and one of those people was at the gym. Robert was a regular at a local fitness center in the Houston area. It was his escape, his place to decompress after shifts. But it also became the place where he began shopping for a killer. According to trial testimony, Robert approached multiple people at the gym, testing the waters, seeing who might be willing to help him. He started with the gym owner, someone he considered a friend. "Do you know someone who can kill my wife?" Robert asked one day, as casually as if he were asking for a referral to a mechanic. The gym owner was stunned. He thought it was a joke. He laughed nervously and brushed it off, but Robert kept asking. Week after week, the question came up again. The gym owner realized Robert wasn't joking. Eventually, Robert found someone who didn't laugh it off, someone who listened with interest, someone who saw an opportunity. His name was Joseph Pristash, and he was about to become the middleman in a murder-for-hire plot. Pristash was a 39-year-old former mechanic with a long criminal record. He wasn't a hitman, but he knew people. He had connections in Houston's underworld, and more importantly, he had access to someone desperate enough to pull the trigger. That person was Howard Paul Guidry, a 17-year-old kid with a troubled past and a willingness to do anything for money. Robert laid out the plan. He wanted Farah dead. He wanted it to look like a robbery or a random attack. He didn't want to be anywhere near the crime when it happened. And most importantly, he wanted it done quickly. The price? $3,000 and a Jeep. To Robert, that was a small price to pay for freedom. Freedom from the divorce. Freedom from custody battles. Freedom from Farah. Pristash agreed to set it up. Guidry agreed to be the shooter. And Robert? Robert agreed to take his kids to church the night it happened, ensuring he had an ironclad alibi. Everything was in place. The plan was set. And on November 9th, 1994, it all came together. November 9th, 1994. Atascocita, Texas. It was a Wednesday evening, cool and quiet. The kind of night where families were settling in for dinner, kids were finishing homework, and the streets were mostly empty. Farah Fratta had spent the afternoon at a local hair salon. She had her shoulder-length hair cut short, a fresh, clean look. Friends later said it was symbolic. Farah was moving on. She was closing the door on her marriage to Robert and opening a new chapter. At around 6:45 p.m., Farah pulled into the driveway of her home at 137 Napier Lane. She drove a red Mustang convertible, a car she loved and had worked hard to afford. She hit the button to open the garage door and pulled inside. As the garage door closed behind her, Farah turned off the engine and reached for her purse. She was tired but relieved to be home. Her kids were with Robert for the evening, which meant she had a rare moment of peace. She opened the car door and stepped out. That's when she saw him, a man in black, his face covered by a mask, standing just a few feet away. Before she could scream, before she could run, before she could even process what was happening, he raised a revolver and fired. The first shot hit her in the head, the second hit her in the neck. Farah collapsed immediately. Blood pooled around her body as she lay face down on the cold garage floor. The gunman stood over her for a moment, making sure she was dead, then turned and fled. The shots were loud enough to be heard by a neighbor across the street. The neighbor, an older woman, had been sitting in her living room when she heard the unmistakable crack of gunfire. She ran to her window and looked outside. That's when she saw him. A man, dressed in all black, crouched near the bushes beside Farah's house. He was moving quickly, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. Then a car pulled up. The man jumped in and the car sped off. The neighbor didn't hesitate. She picked up the phone and dialed 911. "I just heard gunshots," she told the dispatcher. "And I saw a black man in a mask running from my neighbor's house. He got into a car and drove away." Emergency responders arrived within minutes. They found the garage door still closed. When they opened it, they saw Farah lying in a pool of blood, her red Mustang parked just inches away. Paramedics checked for a pulse, but it was too late. Farah Fratta, 33 years old, mother of 3, was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later confirmed what investigators already suspected. This was an execution. 2 close-range gunshots, one to the head and one to the neck. The shooter wanted to make absolutely sure she was dead. While police were securing the crime scene, Robert Allan Fratta was at church with his 3 children. It was wildly out of character. Robert never took the kids to church. He wasn't a religious man, but that night, of all nights, he suddenly decided it was important. When police contacted him to inform him of his ex-wife's death, Robert's reaction was off. He didn't break down. He didn't cry. He didn't ask frantic questions like, "Who did this?" or "Are my kids safe?" Instead, he was calm, detached, almost robotic. Officers at the scene found his behavior so strange that they made a note of it in their reports. One investigator later testified that Robert seemed more annoyed than devastated, as if Farah's murder was an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. But Robert had an alibi. He was at church, there were witnesses, the timeline checked out, and without any physical evidence linking him to the crime, police had no grounds to arrest him. Still, something didn't sit right. Detectives began asking questions. They pulled Farah's divorce records and found a trail of complaints and restraints. They interviewed friends who said Farah had feared for her life. They talked to her attorney, who said Farah believed Robert would kill her. But belief isn't proof, and without a murder weapon, without a witness, without a confession, the case went cold. For 5 long months, Farah's killer walked free, and Robert Allan Fratta went on with his life as if nothing had happened. The weeks and months following Farah Fratta's murder were agonizing for her family. They knew Robert was involved. Her father said it the moment he arrived at the crime scene. "Bob Fratta has done this." But knowing something and proving it are 2 very different things. Harris County homicide detectives were under pressure. The case was high profile. A young mother, gunned down in her garage, her ex-husband a former cop with a perfect alibi. The media was watching, the community wanted answers, But the investigation kept hitting dead ends. The crime scene had been meticulously cleaned. No fingerprints, no DNA, no shell casings. The killer had picked them up or they were taken by Pristash later. The murder weapon was gone, and the 911 caller's description of a black man in a mask wasn't enough to make an arrest. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors asking if anyone had seen anything suspicious. A few neighbors recalled seeing an unfamiliar car parked on the street that evening, but no one had written down a license plate number. Investigators pulled Robert in for questioning multiple times. Each time he came in willingly, played the role of the cooperative ex-husband, and denied any involvement. During one particularly tense interview, detectives asked him a hypothetical question. "What do you think should happen to someone who kills another person?" Robert didn't hesitate. "They should rot in prison forever." Then came the follow-up. "What about a husband who kills his wife?" Robert paused. A slight smirk crossed his face. "That depends," he said. The detectives were stunned. What kind of answer was that? But Robert wasn't done. In another interview, conducted just one day after Farah's murder, Robert was caught on camera smiling. Not a nervous smile, not a grief-stricken attempt to hold it together. A genuine, relaxed smile, as if he were sitting down for a casual chat. Investigators knew they were dealing with someone cold, calculating and confident that he'd gotten away with murder. But they didn't give up. Behind the scenes, detectives were building a profile. They re-interviewed Robert's co-workers, and that's when the pieces started to fall into place. Multiple people came forward to say that Robert had talked about killing Farah. He'd asked around for a hitman. He'd made comments about taking care of the problem. One co-worker testified that Robert had specifically mentioned wanting to hire someone of African-American descent to carry out the hit, thinking it would make the crime look like a random robbery. Detectives also started looking into Robert's finances. They pulled his bank records and phone logs. They found calls to payphones, suspicious withdrawals, and payments that didn't add up. But still, no smoking gun. Then came March 1995, exactly 5 months after Farah's murder. Houston police arrested a 17-year-old named Howard Paul Guidry in connection with an unrelated bank robbery. During the arrest, officers recovered stolen cash, a handgun, and ballistic evidence. The revolver Guidry was carrying was sent to the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab for routine testing. When ballistics experts fired test rounds and compared them to the bullets recovered from Farah Fratta's body, they got a match. The gun that killed Farah Fratta was in the hands of Howard Paul Guidry. Detectives brought Guidry in for questioning. At first, he refused to talk, but as the evidence piled up, as detectives laid out what they knew, Guidry realized he was going down. And that's when he made a choice. He decided to cooperate. Guidry confessed. He admitted he was the shooter. He walked detectives through the entire night, step by step. He took them to the crime scene and showed them exactly where he had been hiding, exactly how he had positioned himself, and exactly how he had fired the shots. But more importantly, he gave them names. He told them about Joseph Pristash, the man who had recruited him, supplied the gun, and drove him to and from the crime scene. And he told them about Robert Allan Fratta, the man who had paid for it all. The case that had been cold for 5 months suddenly exploded wide open. With Howard Guidry's confession in hand, detectives moved quickly. They brought in Joseph Pristash for questioning, and the pressure was on. Pristash was a 39-year-old former mechanic with a rap sheet that included theft, assault, and drug charges. He wasn't a mastermind, he wasn't a professional criminal. He was a guy who saw an opportunity to make some money and didn't think about the consequences. At first, Pristash denied everything. But when detectives showed him the evidence, the ballistics match, Guidry's confession, the phone records, he realized the walls were closing in. Pristash eventually admitted his role. He confirmed that Robert Fratta had approached him at the gym. He confirmed that he had recruited Guidry. He confirmed that he had supplied the murder weapon and driven Guidry to Farah's house the night of the murder. But Pristash's confession alone wasn't enough. Prosecutors needed corroborating evidence. They needed proof that Robert Fratta was the puppet master pulling the strings. And that's when they found Mary. Mary was Joseph Pristash's girlfriend at the time of the murder. She had been living with him in their apartment, and on the night of November 9th, 1994, she had witnessed something that would change everything. According to Mary's testimony, she came home that evening to find Howard Guidry sitting outside the apartment building, dressed head to toe in black. She thought it was strange but didn't say anything. Minutes later, Pristash walked in. He was holding a revolver. Without saying a word, he walked into the bedroom and tossed the gun onto the bed. Then he went into the kitchen and emptied the spent shell casings into the trash. Mary stood there, frozen. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew something was very, very wrong. Pristash looked at her and said, "Yes, she's dead." Mary's blood ran cold. She didn't ask who, she didn't ask why, she just turned away. For weeks, Mary said nothing. She didn't go to the police. She didn't tell anyone what she had seen. She was terrified. Terrified of Pristash, terrified of being implicated, terrified of what might happen if she spoke up. But when detectives finally tracked her down and confronted her, warning that she could be charged with accessory to murder if she withheld evidence, she broke down and told them everything. She told them about the gun. She told them about the shell casings. She told them about the meetings at the gym. She even told them about the serial number on the revolver. She had written it down out of instinct, sensing that one day it might matter. That serial number matched the murder weapon recovered from Guidry. Mary's testimony was devastating. It corroborated Guidry's confession. It placed Pristash at the scene. And most importantly, it connected everything back to Robert Allan Fratta. Prosecutors now had a clear timeline. Robert approached Pristash at the gym, Pristash recruited Guidry, they planned the murder, Guidry carried it out, and Robert paid them with $3,000 and a Jeep. Phone records backed it up. In the days leading up to the murder, Robert had made multiple calls to Pristash's home. On the night of the murder, calls were made from a payphone near the crime scene, the same payphone Guidry said he used to confirm the hit was done. Surveillance footage and witness statements placed Pristash's vehicle near Farah's neighborhood that evening. And then there was the money. Prosecutors traced a $3,000 withdrawal from Robert's bank account, made just days after the murder. The web of evidence was complete. Robert Allan Fratta was no longer a grieving ex-husband with an alibi. He was a murder-for-hire conspirator, and the state of Texas was coming for him. In April 1996, Robert Allan Fratta was arrested and charged with capital murder. The trials of Robert Allan Fratta, Joseph Pristash, and Howard Paul Guidry were some of the most closely watched in Harris County history. The case had everything: a cop-turned-killer, a murder-for-hire plot, a grieving family, and a community demanding justice. Robert's trial began in April 1996. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. They laid out the timeline step by step, showing how Robert had planned Farah's murder for months. They presented testimony from Robert's co-workers, who said he had openly talked about wanting his wife dead. They showed the jury phone records linking Robert to Pristash. They presented financial records showing the $3,000 payment, and then came the star witnesses, Howard Guidry and Mary. Guidry took the stand and walked the jury through the entire night. He described how Pristash had picked him up, handed him the gun, and driven him to Farah's house. He described waiting in the shadows, watching Farah pull into the garage, and then pulling the trigger. When asked why he did it, Guidry said simply, "I needed the money, and Bob Fratta was paying." Mary's testimony was equally powerful. She broke down in tears as she recounted the night of the murder, describing how Pristash had come home with the gun and told her Farah was dead. The defense tried to poke holes in the prosecution's case. They argued that Guidry and Mary were unreliable witnesses, that they had reasons to lie. They pointed out that there was no physical evidence directly tying Robert to the crime scene. But the jury wasn't buying it. The circumstantial evidence was too strong. The motive was too clear. And Robert's behavior, his cold, detached demeanor, his lack of emotion, his refusal to show any remorse, spoke volumes. On April 24, 1996, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of capital murder. Robert showed no reaction. He sat there, stone-faced, as the judge read the verdict aloud. The sentencing phase began immediately. Under Texas law, capital murder carries only two possible sentences: life in prison without parole, or death. Prosecutors argued that Robert deserved the death penalty. They pointed to the premeditated nature of the crime, the fact that he had used his position as a public safety officer to manipulate and intimidate, and the complete lack of remorse. Farah's family testified, describing the pain of losing her and the impact on her 3 children, who now had to grow up without a mother. Even Robert's own children testified against him. His daughter took the stand and said, "My mother never got to see us grow up. She missed our first prom. She missed our graduations. She missed our weddings. She missed everything because our father took her life." The jury deliberated for just a few hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: death by lethal injection. Robert Allan Fratta was sentenced to death on April 24, 1996. Joseph Pristash's trial followed in July 1996. The evidence against him was just as strong. He had recruited the shooter, supplied the murder weapon, and driven Guidry to and from the crime scene. On July 8, 1996, Pristash was found guilty of capital murder. 3 days later, on July 11th, he was sentenced to death. Finally came Howard Guidry's trial. At just 17 years old at the time of the murder, Guidry was the youngest of the 3. Prosecutors argued that despite his age, he was a willing participant who had pulled the trigger and taken a life. Guidry's defense attorneys tried to paint him as a victim of circumstance, a troubled kid who had been manipulated by older, more experienced criminals. But the jury wasn't swayed. On March 27, 1997, Guidry was convicted of capital murder. On April 16, 1997, he was sentenced to death. All 3 men were now on Texas's death row. But the story didn't end there. Years later, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals overturned all 3 convictions. The court ruled that the introduction of co-conspirator confessions during trial had violated the defendant's rights. Each man would have to be retried. But in the retrials, the outcomes were the same. Prosecutors presented the same evidence, called the same witnesses, and made the same arguments. And once again, all 3 men were found guilty and sentenced to death. In 2009, Robert Allan Fratta was sentenced to death for the 2nd time. Through it all, Robert remained expressionless. He never apologized. He never took responsibility. He never showed an ounce of remorse. And now, the state of Texas was going to make him pay. After his conviction, Robert Allan Fratta was transferred to the Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, home to Texas's male death row. Death row in Texas is unlike any other prison experience. Inmates are housed in solitary confinement, locked in their cells for 23 hours a day. They get 1 hour of recreation time, usually spent alone in a small enclosed yard. Meals are delivered through a slot in the door. Human contact is minimal. For Robert, this would be his life for the next 27 years. Death row inmates live in a strange state of limbo. They know they're going to die, they just don't know when. The appeals process can take decades, with lawyers fighting over procedural issues, evidence admissibility, and constitutional challenges. Robert filed multiple appeals over the years. He challenged the admissibility of Guidry's confession. He challenged the jury instructions. He challenged the use of victim impact testimony. He challenged the constitutionality of lethal injection. Every appeal was denied. Meanwhile, life on death row continued. Robert aged. His hair turned grey. His body weakened. But his attitude never changed. Guards who interacted with him said he was polite but distant. He didn't cause trouble, but he also didn't engage. He kept to himself, spent his days reading, and rarely spoke about his crime. Farah's family, on the other hand, was living a very different kind of sentence. Her father, her siblings, and most painfully, her 3 children, were forced to live with the aftermath of her murder every single day. Her children grew up without a mother. They missed her at every milestone: birthdays, graduations, weddings, the births of their own children. The pain never went away. It just became part of who they were. In interviews years later, Farah's daughter said, "People ask me if I've forgiven my father. The answer is no. How do you forgive someone who took away the person you loved most in the world? How do you forgive someone who never even said he was sorry?" As the years passed, Robert's co-conspirators faced their own fates. Joseph Pristash remained on death row for over 2 decades, but he never made it to the execution chamber. On June 19, 2025, at the age of 70, Pristash died of natural causes in his cell at the Polunsky unit. His death marked the end of a man who had turned murder into a transaction. Howard Guidry, the youngest of the 3, remains on death row to this day. Now in his 40s, he has spent more than half his life behind bars. His execution date has not yet been set, but unless his sentence is commuted, he will one day face the same fate as Robert Allan Fratta. January 9th, 2023. The Polunsky Unit, Livingston, Texas. For Robert Allan Fratta, this was the last full day of his life. After nearly 3 decades on death row, his appeals had finally run out. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals had denied his final petition. The U.S. Supreme Court had declined to hear his case. His execution was scheduled for the following evening. Robert spent the day like any other death row inmate facing execution. He was allowed to make phone calls to family members, though it's unclear if anyone accepted. He was given the standard prison meal: peanut butter and jelly sandwich, scrambled eggs, cereal and milk. Texas no longer allows last meal requests. That tradition was abolished in 2011 after a death row inmate ordered an enormous feast and then refused to eat any of it. Now condemned inmates eat the same meal as everyone else on the unit. But even if Robert had been allowed a last meal, it's unlikely he would have requested anything special. He had spent 27 years showing no remorse, no emotion, no humanity. Why would his final day be any different? Outside the prison, protesters gathered. Some held signs calling for the abolition of the death penalty. Others held signs supporting Farah's family and demanding justice. The media set up cameras ready to broadcast the execution to the world. Inside, Robert's attorneys made one last desperate attempt to stop the execution. They filed an emergency appeal with the federal court, arguing that the pentobarbital used in Texas's lethal injection protocol had expired and could cause excruciating pain, violating the 8th Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. A federal judge issued a temporary stay, halting the execution just hours before it was scheduled to begin. For a brief moment it seemed like Robert might get a reprieve, but the stay didn't last long. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals quickly overruled the federal judge, and within hours, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene. The execution was back on. At 6:00 p.m., Robert was moved from the Polunsky unit to the Huntsville unit, the site of Texas's execution chamber. He was dressed in white prison garb, shackled at the wrists and ankles, and escorted by guards down a long, sterile hallway. He was placed in a holding cell just outside the execution chamber. A chaplain was offered, but Robert declined. He had no interest in spiritual counsel. He had no interest in making peace with God or with his past. At 6:39 p.m., Robert was led into the execution chamber. It's a small clinical room with pale green walls and fluorescent lighting. In the center of the room is a gurney, and next to it, an IV stand. Robert was strapped down, his arms extended, his legs secured, his chest tightly bound. IV lines were inserted into both arms. Behind a glass window, witnesses watched in tense silence. Among them were Farah's brother and Robert's own children, stone-faced and somber. The warden stepped forward and asked the question required by Texas law. "Do you have any last words?" Robert turned his head slightly. He looked at the ceiling, and then he said nothing. No apology, no explanation, no plea for forgiveness, just silence. The warden nodded. The signal was given. The first drug, pentobarbital, began to flow into Robert's veins. It's a barbiturate, designed to render the person unconscious within seconds. Robert exhaled deeply, his eyes fluttered. He snored several times, an involuntary reflex as his body shut down. And then he went still. At 7:49 p.m. on January 10th, 2023, Robert Allan Fratta was pronounced dead. The man who had once paid $3,000 to have his wife silenced had met his own state-sanctioned end. Quietly, legally, and alone. For the family of Farah Fratta, Robert's execution was not a celebration. It was not a moment of triumph. It was simply the closing of a chapter that had been open for far too long. Farah's brother released a statement after the execution. He said, "Today, justice was served. But justice doesn't bring Farah back. It doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't give us back the years we lost. All it does is ensure that the man who took her from us can never hurt anyone else." Farah's children, now adults with families of their own, have chosen to live their lives away from the public eye. They have carried the weight of their mother's murder for nearly 30 years, and while Robert's execution may have brought some sense of closure, the scars will never fully heal. As for Howard Guidry, he remains on Texas's death row awaiting his own execution date. Joseph Pristash, the middleman who set the entire plot in motion, died of natural causes in 2025, escaping the fate that awaited him in the execution chamber. This case serves as a chilling reminder of what can happen when anger, control, and obsession are allowed to fester. Robert Allan Fratta wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a random criminal. He was a husband, a father, and a man trusted to uphold the law. But when his marriage fell apart, when he realized he was losing control, he made a choice, and that choice destroyed lives, Farah's, his children's, and ultimately his own. If there's a lesson to be learned from this story, it's this: leaving an abusive relationship is dangerous, but staying can be deadly. If you or someone you know is in a situation where you fear for your safety, please reach out for help. There are resources, hotlines, and advocates ready to support you. Thank you for watching True Crime Matters. If this case moved you, please like, subscribe, and share this video. And remember, justice may be slow, but it is relentless. Until next time, stay safe.